right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fifth annual GSD virtual town hall. This is actually, I think, one of the only good things that came out of COVID was doing these virtual town halls. It's really exciting to me to see the people who are coming into the attendee list. It's a little distracting for me, but it's really nice to see some names of people I know well. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Duke. Haven't seen you in a long time. A bunch of people on there. And so thank you for joining us. Especially thank you to those of you who are joining us from remote time zones, to put it broadly. There are about 60 people who signed up from around the world, and that's really impressive to me. So I'm going to keep my comments very short because I want to get into, we have a very good, meaty discussion today with three guests who will be speaking. But I wanted to just give you a little bit of a quick introduction. We've just started the spring semester. I think this is week 2, so we're 10 days in at a time that's obviously, well, let's say it's a moment of disruption in the world, as seems to be the new normal, if it were. So first, thinking and sending out our thoughts to everyone who dealt with the wildfires in Los Angeles. So Jerome, La La Land. I am really, I think everyone is reeling from the photos that we've seen, the videos that we've seen of the destruction in Altadena and the Palisades, among other places. So we hope that you're doing okay. Second, there's obviously been a moment of kind of a lot of distractions of starting off the new year and sort of dealing with all our new students coming in, new classes for the semester, all this exciting stuff. And then everyone in the building being kind of distracted by their news feeds. I want to reiterate President Garber's message that I think all of our alumni received, but it was sent out on Tuesday, January 28th. But let me just read from that to just sort of set the stage, because I think it was a sort of perfect way of understanding how we at the university are dealing with this moment. So Garber wrote, "In these challenging times, our efforts will be guided by our values and our commitments, supporting academic excellence and the pursuit of knowledge, championing open inquiry, constructive dialogue, and academic freedom, building a community in which people of all backgrounds, all perspectives, all experiences come together to learn, to grow, and to thrive, and embracing the rights and responsibilities that membership in such a community demands." That's a long sentence. I speak as an editor, but it's a really important one, and it's one that we very much share. I think this is a moment for all of us to support education, whether K through 12 or higher ed, because nothing's more important for the future of our universe. Here at the school, we've dived into this semester with 2 events that were really, I think, important for the school at setting that stage of values and sentiment and togetherness. One was an event that opened the exhibit that's in the Drucker Design Gallery called Envisioning Cluny. It's an exhibit curated by Christine Smith, who teaches here, teaches architectural history. And the event featured the music historian Thomas Forrest Kelly, as well as a polyphonic music group called Blue Heron. It was an amazing event where you had polyphonic music from the 14th century filling Piper Auditorium, and an entire auditorium of visitors and students just transfixed. The exhibit, which it really encourage everyone to come and see, is focused on how Kenneth Conant taught architectural history here from 1924 to about 1955. And he is the one who is responsible for these plaster casts that are all over Harvard, but especially in our special collection. So we have 8 casts, full-scale casts of capitals from Cluny, the abbey at Cluny from the 14th century, And those are right now in our gallery. So you walk in and suddenly you're transported to the 14th century. And I think what's interesting about this exhibit and the opening event was underscoring the importance of envisioning architecture through techniques of drawing, modeling, photography. And that's actually going to be part of our discussion today as we feature on instruments of practice. So that was very exciting, and I do encourage everyone to see that exhibit. We also, on Monday night, had the Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne speak about horizontal universality as a means of understanding how we can reach a different kind of, let's say, universal human understanding through a kind of analogy of translation, that we can understand different cultures through almost like understanding the translation of different languages. And I think his call for a form of universalism that's not singular, but has that kind of intellectual elasticity was very timely. This Thursday, we have the Mayor's Institute for City Design effort with working with Tony Griffin on her Mayor's Imagining the Just City, which is a class that she offers to 8 mayors from around the country every year for 11 weeks. And the class starts this week, and there's an event on Thursday that launches that event, where these mayors are learning different strategies and means of rendering cities just. So these are just some of the things going on at the school that's setting the tone, let's say, for this this new year, this new era, in terms of understanding some of the things that are timeless for what we do, and yet critical for ensuring that we have an impact on the world. A little housekeeping before we launch into the event. So this is being recorded. The video will be shared on the GSD's YouTube channel in the coming weeks, and there's closed captioning available. All of you who have been on different Zoom events know that that's the CC button on the bottom that you generate AI-generated captions. There will be time for audience questions at the end after a brief panel discussion. So let me launch into introducing our speakers today. We start with Elizabeth Christoforetti, who is the co-editor of the new issue of the Harvard Design Magazine called Instruments of Service. It's backwards on that screen, but you can figure it out, and you can order this. We're going to put in the chat how you can get the new issue of the Harvard Design Magazine. So this issue was co-edited by two of our speakers today, Elizabeth Christoforetti and Jacob Reidel. Elizabeth, who has the firm Supernormal, a design studio based here in Cambridge, pioneers changes at the intersection of architecture, urbanism, and technology. She focuses on emerging design practices in the built environment, emphasizing the role of technology and socio-technical systems. And so her work is very timely. Jacob Reidel, who is also going to be presenting today on the instruments of service, they're both assistant professors in practice of architecture here. Jacob's an architect whose work reimagines architectural practice. He's served as a senior director both at Saltmine and WeWork, focusing on innovative design and collaboration. He also co-founded and edited Clog magazine, and has a long-standing commitment to the role of discourse in print. David Fixler is our third presenter today. He is the chair of our faculty building committee at the GSD and a lecturer in architecture here. He's an architect. Many of you probably know him by name. He specializes in the conservation and adaptive reuse of existing buildings, particularly focusing on 20th century modernism. I first learned of him when the Baker House at MIT was being renovated. He was doing that. He also rehabilitated the United Nations headquarters in New York. So he has some pretty amazing commissions to his name. He's a fellow of the AIA. He's contributed extensively to global conservation organizations and has published widely on architectural preservation. So Elizabeth and Jacob will present first for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then David will present for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a I will moderate a discussion among the group of us, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you all. So onward. Thank you very much. And I turn it to Elizabeth and Jacob.
Can you hear us? Someone give a thumbs up?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, terrific. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen then. And we'll go to the slideshow. And I will trust that everyone can see what I'm sharing. But first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. I am Jacob Reidel, Assistant Professor in Practice at the GSD, as Dean Whiting said, and she provided a full introduction, so there's no need for me to say anything else about that. Sorry, I'm going to move one thing on my screen here. Great, now we're all set up. So Elizabeth and I are going to present kind of the give you a quick overview of the Harvard Design Magazine, issue 52, Instruments of Service, and then we'll be handing off to David. And I trust that it will make sense to everyone why we have why we are particularly paired up today to present to this group. First of all, before we go through the issue, Elizabeth and I just want to acknowledge that while we co-guest edited this issue, it really only came together because of a really amazing team. First of all, we just want to thank Dean Whiting for supporting us in this issue from the beginning all the way to completion, even supporting us in the proposal of this theme, which may seem to some as being very dry. I trust you will see that it is anything but. Also, Meg Sandberg, Ken Stewart from Harvard Design Magazine, editor-in-chief, Ken, managing editor Meg. It just would not have been possible to put together this issue without them, their support and their work every day. And of course, the graphic designers, Alexis Mark, and all the students who worked with us, who were credited in the issue on so much of the research that is contained therein. We're not going to go through the entire issue, but I trust you will see that we represent a diverse range of contributors, from academics to practitioners to artists, and frankly, everything in between, including spec writers. So we will encourage you to take a look at the issue and actually see the diversity of contributors that really do comprise something that is, we believe, greater than the sum of its parts. As an introduction, however, I just want to walk you through our editor's letter, where explains where the theme comes from. When we talk about instruments of service, or I should say the issue itself, what we were doing is the intent is to look at what architects actually make and how this is changing. Now, so many of you are in practice and but I think it bears repeating that as defined in standard form contracts from the American Institute of Architects, instruments of service are representations in any medium of expression, now known or later developed, of the tangible and intangible creative work performed by the architect and the architect's consultants under their respective professional services agreements. Instruments of service may include, without limitation, studies, surveys, models, sketches, drawings, specifications, and other similar materials. We intentionally wanted to include this language in the introduction because this is, for all of you who have worked with standard form AAI contracts, this is what instruments of service mean legally, correct? However, what we believe in, and the premise behind this issue, is that what architects make is inextricably tied to whom or what they are making something for and why. And when the nature of what architects make changes, that is, when the nature of their instrumentation changes, the organizational structure and operating frameworks of design, as both a practical and intellectual endeavor, also become malleable. In other words, we believed it was incredibly important to look at what architects actually make, because this actually tells us a lot about what architects' role in society is and how that is changing. So the idea is to look really that anything speaks for itself. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Elizabeth, who's going to walk us through some of the major themes contained in the issue.
Great, thanks, Jacob. So this piece by George Johnson kicks off the issue and highlights that the architect, as we know the architect, is a social construct that's shaped by the values of their time. It's a really, excuse me, this is a great framing device as the first piece in the issue, in that it clarifies the role, identity, and agency of the architect as impacted by the conditions of a society in a moment, but also that we have the capacity to shape our response to these externalities and to self-determine who we will become as a profession. So just to say it out loud, of course, the externalities of our own time include climate crisis, rapid technological change, social inequity, and market pressures. And it sort of sets up our moment as one of change and self-reflection right at the get-go. Next. So Jacob had mentioned that the title instruments of service is both meant literally and figuratively, in that we as architects are ourselves instruments of service to society, and we have a duty to serve the public good as part of our grand bargain with society. So this conversation with Jack Self, Tony Griffin, and Nikhil Saval, who's a state senator in Pennsylvania, opens up how practice, as well as the institutions that are charged with training practitioners like us at the GSD, must change to accommodate the imperatives of our time. Next. And as a way to be much more precise as we were shaping the issue about where and how design practice is changing, we pull out and consider these three distinct but related frameworks that influence what we make and who we become as architects. So the practice, profession, and discipline of architecture cultivate, reflect, and amplify the value systems of our time in different ways and to different degrees. The practice of designing buildings in urban form is ancient, enduring, global, and continuously changing as an endeavor. Excuse me, that is highly responsive to shifts in technology, politics, and economic structures. The profession of architecture is relatively new by those standards and fundamentally local, bound to the geographic and political limits of licensure. It is subject to the regulatory infrastructure and constructed values of a given state or nation. Finally, the discipline of architecture, as we know it here in the US, is a body of cultural and theoretical knowledge emerging from the very specific context of the European Renaissance and the value systems of American settlement. It defines architecture as an intellectual pursuit and prepares designers for the world. Next. Thank you. The three frameworks shape the nature and capacity of our impact in the world around us. Sometimes they work together and sometimes they're at odds. For example, a structural push towards professionalization and specialization over the past decades. So we can think here about the remarkable advances in building technology and energy modeling that we'll be talking about today. In a way, these also kind of pose a challenge for the intellectual project of architecture as a bounded discipline for cultural production. So we see a kind of tension in a way between the discipline and the profession. Next. Meanwhile, the practice of designing buildings generally in the world remains agile and agnostic to change. And agnostic to the discipline and profession. From homeowners to global practices that operate in many countries and territories. In the face of all of these external pressures shaping our field from the outside in, practice is simply reshaping itself to absorb change, while the aging profession is growing a bit brittle due to the accumulation of regulating norms and a general resistance to change. And as we were doing research for the issue, we discovered something very interesting, that although there is this internal tension, and although we face many pressures from the outside in, there is not any metric, at least related to growth, that we could suggest that the discipline, practice, or profession are suffering. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They're growing quite quickly. The number and territory of graduate degrees is growing explosively. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the year-over-year growth of the profession is outpacing other industries in a significant way. And practice is generating new and better technologies and mechanics to construct our built environment with or without the help of the discipline and profession. Though we could debate, I suppose, about whether growth is the right metric to address positive change. All right, so next, please. All right, so finally, in keeping with this hope to pull apart practice from the outside in and the inside out, this fascinating conversation between economist Daniel Susskind and the presidents of the AIA, the AMA, which is the American Medical Association, and the ABA, which is the American Bar Association, shows that the conversations around these externalities, of course, really there was a significant focus on things like artificial intelligence. We're really having the same conversations across the professions. We have some very similar and shared hopes and fears. There's a concern over diminishing professional expertise in a world of information democratization and access, but also a great hope that the new technologies and capabilities will allow us to better fulfill the promise of society, the promise of service that we make to society. Our skills, expertise, and even the nature of our relationships with our generalized and specialized project collaborators are changing in both visible and invisible ways. And Jacob, I'll hand it back to you from there.
Unmuted myself. You can hear me? Yes. I see someone. Yes, thank you. So we've talked about values. We're not going to go through every theme in the issue, but for today's conversation, we wanted to sketch out the kind of core of the premise and of the instruments of service, and also to talk about one of the key themes that emerged throughout it, was collaboration and conflict. There's a roundtable we organized in the issue with Greg Armisa, Phil Bernstein, John Cerrone, and Alexis McGuffin. Greg is an attorney with Studio Gang. Phil Bernstein was a former executive at Autodesk, who's now at the Yale School of Architecture. John Cerrone is with Shop, and Alexis McGuffin is with Suffolk Construction. So we have the legal side, practice side, technology side of architectural practice and construction together. And it was a fascinating conversation. We don't have time to go through all of it here, but one of the key quotes that came out of it was, you see below, the building industry is highly resistant to change and people don't trust each other. There were moments in the conversation that were optimistic, others that were not, but at the end of the day, it came down to the promise of BIM, and in many ways the unrealized promise of BIM, or building information modeling, which we are now many decades now into the experiment with BIM. It's no longer an experiment, it's just the tool so many of us use. But the type of collaboration that was promised in the early years, we really haven't seen. In the case of this conversation was discussed that architects are producing their documents very much in 2D, or at least and outputting it in 2D, and then the construction, basically contractors, are rebuilding the model entirely, so it can meet their standards. There's many reasons for this, but the end of the day is that the collaboration we were hoping to see and have always been talking about the promise of this that architects have dreamed of has not come to fruition. And this is borne out in many ways, and one is that we examined in the issue just the growth in the complexity of documents that architects work with, actually architects, contractors, clients. One study that Elizabeth and I and our research assistants conducted was looking at the evolution of standard form architectural contracts over the last century. And you can see in this graphic here, the explosion in number of contracts, forms of contracts, as really an index, as well as the explosion in the complexity of architectural practice. Moving again, another document we were looking specifically at was the growth of the size of construction document sets. For this study, we looked at basically an archive that Harvard has of every project and all the documents going back to that. And we actually looked by decade going back to the 18th century all the way through to today. And, I think the graphic speaks for itself. You can see how the size of construction documents has just progressively grown. And you can see certain benchmarks when that happens. You see, Gund Hall, for example, the original drawing set, which was produced in the late 1969, numbers around, 40 or actually 60 some sheets. Then you go to fast forward to 2016 in the Science and Engineering Complex at Harvard, where I don't expect you to count this all up on screen, but this is basically showing about 1,100, so over 1,000 sheets. Now, of course, scale, size of the projects, complexity of the projects are different, but this is also showing, I think in a kind of snapshot way, if you squint, you can see what is happening, right? We are producing more and more documents. There's various reasons for this. One, you see an explosion in the 80s with the liability crisis and architects begin drawing defensively. I think these trends will speak and be familiar to many of us on this call today. However, we wanted to look for this purposes of this conversation at the most recent project here at Harvard, or the GSD, the Gund Hall envelope phase. And Brunner Kott was actually kind enough to share their set with us. And, this obviously the scope of the Gund Hall envelope project is very different from the scope of the original Gund Hall, not to mention the Science and Engineering Complex, but it is a very tight set. Elizabeth and I looked at it. The Gund Hall envelope is coming in at each one of these lines is about 20 sheets, so it's about 46 sheets. And when we spoke with David about this, it actually became very clear that the way the team worked together on the Gund Hall envelope project was atypical and produced efficiencies, in many ways kind of realizing some of the dreams of the conversations that are in the issue of finding this collaborative way of working between architects, builders, manufacturers, and clients. I think that is borne out actually in this project, what David is going to now tell us more about. So just to wrap this up, about a section about instruments of service, this is a spread from the issue. This is a drawing or a painting probably many of us have seen in an architectural history course or some other courses. Thomas Cole's famous The Architect's Dream from 1840, where 200 years ago-ish, the dream of the architect was focusing on forms, styles. Perhaps in a way today's dream of the architect is more perhaps about process and new efficiencies, new forms of collaboration, and new ways of working. And with that, we're going to hand it over to David, who is going to tell us about the project at Gund that just was completed.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and it's great to be here. Gund Hall is, of course, it's probably was home to most of you. There may be a few of you in the audience who predate it, but obviously it's a building that has occupied a unique place in the world of architecture and the conscience of architecture around the world for many years. And I'm going to take you quickly through the process that we used to do the work that led to doing the work on the studio glazing last summer. And in that, during the course of that, to talk a little bit about the design assist process, which is what Jacob was referring to in terms of the way in which we both maximized efficiency, but also performance, aesthetics, and frankly, a sense of peace of mind about the fact that everyone had brought into this thing. I'm not going to read off all of the team members here, but first of all, I want to thank Brunner Kott. Most of the slides in this deck come from them, or are modifications of slides that come from them, and they've just been a tremendous partner in this for all along. So they were the design team. They led the design team. There was an owner's team that was basically the then assistant dean for facilities, Kevin Cahill, and Redgate. Redgate stayed through. Kevin, of course, has retired and has been succeeded by Ben Salowitz, but they have been a sort of a rock to the process of getting this work done. And then, given the rapidity of what we were doing and the careful technical calibrations we wanted, we hired Robert Heinches Associates from New York to do one of the great facade consultancies of the world. To do peer review. There was somebody I had worked with on several projects, including the United Nations, and they added immeasurably to the dialogue about the glazing. And then finally, of course, the construction management and construction partners, Shawmut Construction and A&A Window Products, who were the installers and fabricators. And as Sarah mentioned, I am the chair of the Gund Hall GSD Faculty Building Committee, which takes in many different little roles, but the big one has been shepherding this process through. And I had a stellar group of colleagues who you see all listed here, who helped in this process and gave critical guidance at critical moments for us to come up with a product that everyone agreed was the right one for this project. So Gund Hall begins as a simple, honest, and gutsy, but obvious, but also very quirky and unique building. There is nothing else in the world quite like Gund Hall. It is to me, it represents something like grafting a wonderful 19th century train shed onto a blown up vision of the Villa Savoye on the front. But he makes it all work. Andrews makes it all work very much together. It is said that his design came from a partie sketch by Jose Luis Sert. That's nice apocryphal knowledge. We don't know exactly how true that is, but there are people who swear to it. And it is something that has been respected over the years, and whose integrity is key to keeping this going. So the distinguishing character-defining features you see listed on the left, but I want to look at the period values and how what we was able to extend that. The honesty in the expression of materials, if you want to call this a brutalist building, the continuity of expression, site cast concrete, and then, of course, the visible hierarchy of materials and assemblies. And just to remind you, without naming all of these buildings, they are all familiar to you, but they show you the context that Gund Hall fit very nicely into, and both in terms of its common identity characteristics and its unique characteristics. Gund Hall needed a lot of work in the studio. You see there in the center, this is a typical window crossing mullion condition. The mullions were actually made out of neoprene, which was something that people did in the 60s and 70s, taking cues from car glazing, because cars were good at keeping water out. They thought if you put it on a building, it would do the same. But suffice to say, high energy consumption, high energy bills, not a very sustainable structure. These were primary drivers in making this go, as well as doing necessary technology upgrades, and especially working with the quality of light to even it out and bring it back more to what we feel was originally intended for the quality of light within the building. And finally, we added terrace. We extended the accessible floors out onto the terraces and at the edge of each of the trays on the north and south to comply with contemporary accessibility requirements. We began with a conditions analysis. And what I really want to talk about with this is really just to ensure that we knew exactly what we were dealing with. You can see the infrared modeling there. And also the diagram on the upper right, which is a study showing how the filming that had been done in the clear story over the years to cut glare had darkened the center of the studio. And one of the things that was liberated in this project was redoing the glazing in such a way that that was no longer necessary. So, and we built energy and carbon models. I'm not going to go into them given time and the focus of this, but certainly they were built, they were tracked, and they were key at certain junctures to making the kinds of decisions that we made in terms of exactly how far to go with some of the areas of the glazing. The studio is 28% of the floor area of Gund Hall, but it used 46% of the energy, and that made it kind of almost a no-brainer to say this is where we need to concentrate our efforts first, given a limited budget. And then you can see the 5 red stars across the top there on the matrix. That the exterior glazing is the only one that meets all 5 criteria for top priority work. So the nature of the glazing at Gund Hall, as you all know, is you have the north and south curtain walls in orange. You have the purple of the clear story windows, 120 of them. And then you have the east kind of storefront greenhouse glazing that runs from the pit to the chow house. And each of these got its own particular glazing type based on our analysis. And as we were developing, especially the curtain wall, because the east facade was a more straightforward, clear replacement. But what we wanted to do on the curtain wall was leave the primacy of the steel framing, those tubes the white tubes that hold up the floors and the glass in the studio, and make sure that the new system did not encroach upon the sight lines of those in any way. And that's part of what drove us to the design assist process, because nobody in this country makes a 2-inch mullion, which would be necessary in order to do this. So we developed details, which you see here, for the different conditions. This particularly on the looking at what we could do with the 2-inch mullions on the curtain walls. And the red, by the way, is the existing condition. So you can see also exactly how it pushes out. But I want to call your attention to the hybrid VIG in the interest of time, because that's where we ended up. And we ended up there for a couple of reasons, both for a very, very high performance system, but also to ensure that there was going to be no condensation. This is one of the things that a late energy model told us. So this is where we were with the details when we started the construction documents phase. And rather than just going from this into here and picking something out of a catalog or talking to a manufacturer about how to do this, we said, no, we need to develop a system, and we want an American, North American firm to develop the system for reasons of cost and schedule reliability, at least, if nothing else. And so we entered into this design assist process. And by the way, this is here you see a piece of vacuum insulated glazing, 2 very thin pieces of glass with a 0.3 millimeter vacuum space in between them that gives you performance beyond what the triple glazing, which is next door to it, gives you. Now, the triple glazing had its purpose because we had to use that in places where the vacuum insulated glass, which has dimensional limitations, could not go. So here's a very busy slide about the design assist. First of all, for the design assist criteria, picking a partner, we wanted to make sure that there was somebody who understood our aesthetic sensibilities and was prepared to meet them with what they would build. Experience with Harvard and with this team was important, as was the ability to meet a tight schedule and, of course, to staff the job. And we finally came down after a fairly not lengthy, but certainly rigorous process to A&A Window Products and Old Castle Building Envelope, who have their own custom design and fabrication unit in-house. And they worked with us for months over the summer of 2023, where we would sometimes spend 2 hours over a single detail as big as you know, not a whole lot bigger than a silver dollar. So we at the end, we came up with these systems for the various areas. We have the exterior vignettes of the curtain wall and the east facade. And by the way, let me just pause for a second here, because I did want to mention that in looking at the performance and aesthetic criteria, there was some talk about changing the appearance of the curtain walls and going with larger panes of glass, perhaps with structural silicone glazing to give it a more contemporary look. But for a number of reasons, one of which is that you could not use VIG in anything bigger than what we had here, and another was the continuity of history of keeping the aesthetic, but most important, the fact that for the kind of system that we were developing, that we thought was going to give the GSD optimum performance, that it was going to be the most reliable, it would drain the water, it would last the longest, all of those things pointed to a system that really honored the existing grid. And of course, you also had behind each mullion, you had this steel system, which was already there anyway. So again, with attention to the looking at the red sort of double bulb neoprene original system. This is the east facade, which was more rebuilt. I mean, we put in a new structural mullions behind it, but we were also, because of taking advantage of the thickness of the glazing in both the skylight sandwich and in the vertical glazing, there was space to pan this area. And if you look at the lower left detail, you can see that we are insulating around what had been long runs of exposed steel that ran all the way across the east facade and were obviously a great source of heat loss. We were able to mitigate that. And then the other great concentration in working through these details was making sure that the water always had a path, that even if it got into the system somehow, it could get out. But of course, the primary idea is to keep it out of the system. North and south curtain wall here. And here is a diagram that from the energy model actually ended up telling us that the VIG without the third pane, without the hybrid unit, was going to have a pinch point, which would cause condensation. So in adding this third piece, we were comfortable enough now with the thickness of this that we didn't worry about its impacting the aesthetics or the structure for that matter. But we were now able to exceed the energy stretch code because of the performance of this unit. And then how it all goes together, how the various pieces of the mullion covers fit together in such a way that with thermal movement and lateral movement over time, things would not separate. And there was actually a lot of discussion about how you put these components together to maximize the tightness of the system, not only from a performance standpoint, but from a visual standpoint as well. So I'm not going to talk at length about embodied carbon, but suffice to say, once the analysis was done and we figured out what we were doing in terms of what was being removed and what was being added in terms of new carbon, we realized that given where we predict the energy use will go, within 9 years, we will have achieved full carbon payback, which is a relatively short time. And so here we are under construction. It was quite an army. that service this building over the course of the summer and into the fall. But I want to close with this picture because I think it of all the interior shots I have seen of this, and this is of course just prior to finish. You can see that the doors to the terrace aren't yet in, and they're still working off lifts. But the quality of light is evident in this, and it really is. Well, that was automatic. It really is. It's quite magical now to come into the studio, and I think it's the first thing you sense, that all of a sudden the quality of light is a little there. And if I have a couple minutes, I don't know if I do, but if I do, I can show you some vignettes of the mock-up. The mock-up was key to making this project work. It really it was something that, first of all, was pushed hard by the faculty building committee. And the nature of the mock-up is not just something that's done in a lab or done in isolation, but we actually built it into the southeast corner of the building. The pit glazing there, you can see there's one full bay of the curtain wall, one full bay on the east, and then one clear story. And through this and testing these, we had a pretty good idea going into things that our details were going to work, that they were going to be watertight, they were going to be airtight, and that we could proceed with it. It greatly lessens the risk. You know, you can see some of the work that was done in the late fall and winter of last year. And the mock-up of the right here on the edge. And this is a great picture because the 3 bays on the left are the new glass, the 3 bays on the right are the old glass. And you may see, oh, well, it's tinted. It doesn't feel tinted when you walk in. It feels like the other glass in a way is too warm. And it really works. It is but it was, again, gave us a clue. Also, remember that there are all kinds of coatings now in terms of energy enhancing coatings that didn't exist. And they used a mirror coating on the outside for the original. Ours is close to that in terms of matching the appearance, but from the inside, as you can see, it's a very different experience. And with that, I think we can move to the panel. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So I want Elizabeth and Jacob to join us. And I want to really underscore that. So David is soft-spoken, he's gentle, and so you might not sort of feel the full force of what he pulled off, really guiding this project. It was extraordinary. It happened over the summer. They actually just today took down the final parts of the scaffolding around the building. It has, as he said, you capture that really well. And I love that photograph, David, because it does transform the light in the trays, which isn't what we anticipated. We knew that there would be a transformation of temperature. So it's finally, you can, in the trays, work in wintertime without wearing gloves, which I think is a big deal. And I think all of you alumni should make sure that the students understand the value of that, because of course they didn't experience what you had. But the light, the transformation, the feel of the trays is completely different, and it's extraordinary. It was also just an amazing team, and every moment of it was surprisingly smooth, which isn't, that kind of smooth collaboration isn't necessarily what comes out of some of the discussions in your issue of the HDM, Elizabeth and Jacob. And so I first wanted to ask the three of you to talk about sort of the challenges of collaboration. We are forcibly collaborators. That is, architects are sort of we're the neoprene in that gasket, right? That you show, where we have to kind of stretch and deal with all forces around us. And so I wonder if Elizabeth and Jacob, you can speak to the topic of collaboration in HDM, and then David, you can say how it is you managed the magic stardust of this collaboration, which came through so well at Gond. So let's start with that question first.
Yeah, that's great. So when Jacob and I were putting everything together, we kind of put together some, polished articles and some conversations. And there's a conversation in this issue. I'm looking at it right now. It says architects, builders, and the failed promise of deep collaboration. And when we were kind of poking around this issue, it was like a rather pessimistic perspective, to be honest with you. We had an architect and Phil Bernstein from Yale, and Alexis McGuffin from Suffolk, right? Yeah, Suffolk, and an attorney, all having a conversation about IP, integrated project delivery, and a variety of other things. And we really walked away feeling a little bit, concerned about the whole thing. And then we started to talk to David about his experience, and it was frankly kind of remarkable to hear. It brought a sort of spirit of optimism back to the entire conversation. The fact that David was able to collaborate so directly with the manufacturers and really have control over the building in an era when manufactured products are what we specify was really fantastic. So I don't know, David, if you would be willing to talk a little bit about what that collaboration looked like and how you managed to pull off that trust between manufacturer, contractor, and architect.
Sure. Well, I want to give a real serious shout out, especially to the team at Brunner Cott, which is George Gard, Mridula Swaminathan, and Jason Dewhurst and Henry Moss, and Glenn Ryan.
David, can you speak up just a little bit, please?
What's that?
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Glenn Ryan from Shawmut Construction, because he's the guy in the end who had to convince the fabricators that this was going to work. Now, Harvard University should understand that these people really want to work for Harvard, and I think they were willing to bend over a little more than they might normally do in terms of assuming risk. But really, crafting the language for this and basically going into it with a very open mind, saying, we want your ideas. We don't want you to, in other words, we have an idea. This is what we want to do, but we know that you know how to put this together better than we do. And you acknowledge that. And you also, the other person I want to acknowledge is Harrison Morse, who's the guy from A&A Window who led their team. And these were extraordinary professionals that you don't necessarily think of in that way. I've done design assist before, and it was good. We did when we reglazed Kresge Auditorium. We had a rather elaborate design assist process to redo the curtain wall for that, and it worked well. But it wasn't something where we would literally spend hours on computer Zoom calls with the drawings there, looking at these details, and everybody saying, are you okay with that? Are you okay with that? Can we change that angle? Is that, just all of this, and it's to me, it's something that I've also done IDP and not liked it because nobody trusted anybody. The beautiful thing about this is that we managed to achieve a level of trust and sustain that over this intense 2 to 3 months sort of charrette period of the design assist to get the thing done.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. I think we even see in the comments some thoughts about IP, the integrated project delivery, which is, and I actually see Helen's, which, has its proponents and its detractors, right? And I think it also very much depends on the project type. And importantly, I think as Helen's pointing out in the comments, in the region. I think it's also an important thing that Elizabeth and I really saw consistently through the issue, that that we tend to have blinders on in looking at the particular context in which we are practicing, whether it be the city or the sector or the region or the country, and that the kind of conditions of practice vary widely across not just the world, but from city to city. And what is working well in California may not be working well in Massachusetts right now, and vice versa. For us, that's all the more reason why it's important to expand our area of exploration, be looking at how practice works around the world. I actually just happen to have in front of me a deep cut. This is a Harvard Design Magazine from 2010, which was the last time it really examined practice. And there's an amazing piece in it, which I'm sure you can all find, which is about made in architecture or made in Japan can be made anywhere. And it's actually looking specifically at the way the Japanese construction industry is structured, and that the collaborative way in which an architect works with a contractor or a builder on site, making decisions on the fly, because the assumption is that the document set is never going to be fully complete. So it's understood from the very beginning that you were going to be figuring out things as you go. And it's a case study in that older issue of Harvard Design Magazine of how that approach was actually applied successfully at the University of Pennsylvania. So it kind of proves that these experiments are possible. And I think in a way, we highlighted, for the sake of the discussion, the one quote from that conversation, which seemed very pessimistic, but we actually, expanding our scope, see a lot of opportunities for new ways of working. And I think, again, David's example here is a great example, and there's many others, of course, and there are many problems with many of these as well. But that's, I think, we believe in learning through doing, and that's we should be looking also outside our immediate context.
So speaking of learning, and I have to say that the building project, which did not interrupt work in the trays, because somehow they managed to do all of the disruptive work. That photo that David showed at the end, where the trays were overtaken by the construction, was done by the beginning of school. So we were able to enter the trays. There was some work still being done on the exterior, but it was, they kept to a remarkable timeline and enabled us not to have to move elsewhere, which I really appreciated as a dean. But as a result, the construction process, both the mock-up and then the construction itself, has offered a kind of pedagogical tool for the school, which we've had panels, we had a whole explanation of the mock-up for students so that they could learn from it. And then your issue of the magazine, which I just have to give a shout out. It's really one of the most remarkable issues of HDM, really interesting and very relevant to today's practice. That also is relevant to how we are going to practice in the future. And that's what we do here all the time, is we're generating all these students who we hope are going to go off into the world and practice beautifully. So how has the building work for you, David, or the issue for you, Elizabeth and Jacob, affected pedagogy? How do you think some of the topics that you've put on the table are appearing in your classrooms?
Well, I can say I have preached for many years the importance, especially with, I mean, it's from a lot of experience in working on modern buildings, that you engage industry, you partner with industry. One of the most frustrating things I found about the United Nations project is that we had a scheme all worked out to bring these industrial designers on board and rethink all these pieces in a way that reflected what the UN was today, which the Danes actually did with a whole new desk system in the trusteeship council chamber. But so I think this really bears out saying, yeah, this really can work, because you're thinking on the level of the shape of the screw, and you need to start there and work out. So what I like to tell people is that, in the way that sort of working with traditional buildings involves engaging one with craft, you engage the same way within it. You understand industrial processes, you understand what they can and can't. I learned a whole lot about making dies in this process, about where the limits are with certain of these things, and what's feasible and what isn't. So that, I think, as a lesson for young designers, for where they need to go to sort of develop critical ideas, I think a lot of them understand it, but just to reinforce that.
Yeah, as it happens, the issue came in part out of some research in a course called Products of Practice that I'm now teaching for the 5th year. And on the other side of my research with Jacob, the class has transformed quite a bit, and what it means. And I was reflecting on this actually at a conference a couple of weeks ago in Georgia. And I was having a conversation with somebody else who's teaching practice and professional practice. It's so fascinating. It's not just people doing professional practice. They're actually historians and theorists that are now getting involved in this. And so for me, this kind of really bringing guests in for a dialogue that are, Mark Kalin, who any of you who live around here use as he writes your specs, we have Mark Kalin. And then we are also thinking about media theory a bit. And we're trying to look at where we are right now in the arc of history, such that the students can understand that this is not the first time things have changed rapidly. And we do have agency to continue to speculate on how practice can change and what collaboration looks like. And so I think there's a kind of critical optimism, I suppose, that I've really taken from the issue, not to mention some very detailed connections that we've made with more people.
Yeah, I'll just add to that real quickly. I'm sorry, the siren's too loud in the background. I'm in New York right now, so okay. So when it comes to what the students are interested in, there's, I think, for those of you, some of the graduates here, maybe more recent graduates may know this, but there's a very strong interest coming from the bottom up. The students want to be looking at these questions of practice, collaboration, where the profession is going, what it means to even have a career in architecture, whatever that means. So it's very much, all those questions are on the table and being a really pushed, not just by conversations like this, but from the students. So that's, we find very active conversations in studio, in the classrooms at GSD about that, about practice and new ways of working. And something to adding to Elizabeth is that there's, the interest in my courses, and both of us actually share this, in looking at the history, which you'll see in the issue if you look at it, of how the history of practice, especially in the US, is that so many of the things we take for granted today, which seem inevitable, were designed, and they were designed barely 100 to 150 years ago by architects who were doing the best they could under the conditions they were operating within. And I think that that's really important, not for us to understand, within this group, really, but for students to understand this, because not just for fun facts of the history, but of how we got to where we are, but also to really drive home the point that things that may not seem to be working today, then there's no reason to design a different way of doing things, because this was effectively all made up not very long ago, especially when you look at a timeline of how long buildings have been created and designed by humans, right? That's the architectural practice and profession that we have now is a mere blip on that timeline that goes back to, I don't know, Vitruvius or beyond, right? Much further beyond. So I think that's just wanted to make that point. It's and something that does come across through the issue, thinking of what are new ways we could design, new ways of working that we could design in response to the challenges today.
So what about, I think that we're 59% international. Students at the GSD come from, I think, 65 different countries across the world. And so I was intrigued by that Japan article that you showed us, Jacob, from the issue from 2010. How much in your practice classes and how much in your courses that deal with preservation, David, do you talk about the different conditions or different regulations or different modes of practice across the world?
Oh, well, I'll dive in because that was kind of an underhand pitch. I'm teaching a course this semester called "Is the Grass Any Greener? Practice and Project Delivery Around the World." That's actually a comparative study that is looking specifically at 18 different countries and how everything from the architectural education system is designed through licensure and regulation, ultimately then through kind of what instruments of service are in that country, to the actual status and role of an architect in that society. And you see there's some commonalities you'll see across the world, but also things that are really quite radically different from country to country, which is, I think, very important to remind ourselves of, because especially questions around practice and profession tend to be siloed within national borders, within language. There's not a lot of writing about other countries' practice, kind of day-to-day practice in English, and for example, so finding things in translation is harder, and that's something we're working at actually in this course to change. So that's a direct way we're looking at it. I think everyone is actually looking at it, other ways of working in different ways too. I don't know.
David and Elizabeth, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I could share maybe a short thought on practice that, we, since I teach upper level classes, I get quite a bit of MArch 2s as well as MArch 1s. And that means that my students are coming from all over the world and they also are practicing and often licensed. And so the facilitating dialogue between the students, because there's such a radically different degree of knowledge and experience, actually is one of the most effective ways. People are, they once they start those conversations, they can't stop. They're super interested and excited to hear about what licensing looks like, what project delivery looks like. So it's honestly, it's often it's a facilitation role as much as anything else.
Interesting. David?
What I encounter is, and I find so enriching, is just the cultural differences about preservation or conservation. I mean, I get a nice cross section of people from all the disciplines, from MDes, UPD, architecture, and landscape, weighted towards architecture, but really with everybody. But what we talk about a lot is just the attitude towards the primacy of Western ideas of conservation versus ideas that you find elsewhere in the world, where it's more about the place in the idea rather than, strictly speaking, conserving the fabric, if the fabric is sort of beyond repair. And so we really deal with it, and how that impacts practice, of course, means that there are, in many of these countries which have very, deep and rich design traditions, the restoration of buildings as sort of craft objects or industrial objects is not high in their list of priorities for this kind of thing. So they may actually design and build extremely well, but they don't necessarily focus their energy on conservation, and consequently that leads to very different kinds of decisions than what you might have here. And these students are very interested because they're saying it's starting, particularly in China, they say it is starting to change in some ways, that there more attention is being paid to conservation in the Western sense. But it still is it's a different mindset, and I think that's the primary sort of, if you like, cultural diversity that really makes it into my class.
I mean, it's a different mindset across our country as well. So I think it's, it's always difficult to generalize in that way. And Eric is saying exactly the same thing. Yeah, that in the chat. I want to move to absorbing some of the Q&A, and forgive me if I don't get all the questions. We're going to try and make this also natural. So I did want to take on Anthony Flint's point about, is this a major design flaw of the original building? So the original building, which was built in 1972, had single pane glazing, which was normal at that point. I don't think that was a design flaw of brutalism. You could say that those neoprene details were, an unfortunate design experiment of the moment. But I think that one shouldn't sort of condemn an entire category of buildings for things that we upgrade. So we have replaced the single pane glazing with triple pane, which is environmentally conscious and very much part of today's world. Yes, I would have preferred had we inherited a building that had it from the get-go, but we didn't. And so I think that's important. So personally, I wouldn't condemn brutalism. See this project as a condemnation of brutalism. I don't know, David, if you want to chime in on that.
No, I think what you said is very true. I think one could call to question the way in which the whether or not there was a better solution to get the water off the roof without getting it into the building. And I won't pretend to know that to say that I have the solution in my pocket, but that's an invitation for trouble. 120 little roofs and all of those flashing details. However, it's part of the language and poetry of the building at the same time. And the challenge has always been, as you heard from Kevin Cahill and people going all the way back to the 1980s and late 70s. That's part of Gunn's challenge is to keep the blue buckets away, not have to bring them out. And I just saw Abby Suckles post about neoprene glazing, and it's very true. I mean, even as late as, what was this, 1980, 81, I remember talking to Jim Polshek, who had been my dean as I was graduating. And he talked about how exciting he was how excited he was to take apart a BMW and look at the windshield glazing, because that's what they're going to use for their for the windows on the PepsiCo building. So this persisted for a remarkably long time. It was shown as the curtain wall detailing standard in the 1971 edition of Architectural Graphic Standards.
Interesting. I will say
It
that
was interesting.
my mother, who was anything but an architect or knew anything technological, always thought it would be nice if house windows would be like car windows, electric, because she had a trouble lifting. We had very heavy windows from a 1920s house, which I thought was a kind of beautiful idea, but now I'm glad that we didn't do it in our house. There are a couple questions which inevitably ask about financials. And there's someone is asking, would someone talk about the financial aspect, or was there, were there any of this project? Yes, the money was exchanged. I say that facetiously. David said the manufacturers were willing to bend backwards for Harvard. This doesn't occur in typical projects. So I would say, and David can jump in obviously, but I would say partly, I think there was an excitement about working on this building at this institution, and partly there were people on the teams, and there's some people who are participating today in the audience who actually were part of this project team. So you can chime in the chat, but I think that there's something about affecting a school of architecture and this building in particular, which is so beloved by people who have been through it or people who wish they had been through it, right? So I think that we are lucky for that, and the team was so good. So I think the bending over backwards was less a financial incentive and more a sort of love of the building. How much is financial motivation a factor in the success of collaboration is, I think, a very provocative question. And so let me turn to David first, but then maybe Elizabeth and Jacob have some thoughts on that based on the discussions they had in their issue.
Well, you may remember that there was the last bullet in my busy design assist slide was value, and I didn't say anything beyond that. But when we were evaluating the proposals, the 3 proposals for the finalists for the design assist contract, it was certainly part of the discussion. And as a matter of fact, there was one very, I mean, frankly, the team they brought to the table was a very seductive team. I mean, they were really good. They spoke really well. But we in looking at this, and you paid for it at the same time. And we determined that really for our purposes, for what we were looking for, they were overkill, and it was not an appropriate fit. So I think you've got to value takes, and I think has to remark this, saying, what are you really paying for? What if there is a premium involved in this? Why is that premium justified? And it may vary. For certain things you can't compromise, but we actually found areas where we could. And we had some very good negotiators in the people of Glenn from Shawmut and Kevin, who were very, very frank about these things. And I think when I say bend over backwards, I think frankly they had, our team, we were good evangelists. We really told them this is such a special building. It's a unique opportunity. It's going to put you guys on the map in a way that you weren't before, and that helps to sharpen their pencils.
Yeah, what came across for us in our conversations, in and outside of the issue, was maybe less focused on budget per se and more focused on liability. The concern around level of detail is a really big deal, right? So the architects are delivering a BIM model at a very particular level of detail that allows us to, avoid the things that our attorneys are concerned about. And then what happens is that, particularly on high performance buildings, the contractors are, and this is a huge budget, they're actually going and rebuilding the models at a level of detail that they require, such that they can communicate with manufacturers and their subs. And so there is certainly a lot of inefficiency there, and certainly a draw on the budget, but not necessarily because, you know, it's a, you know, in exchange of money per se. It was liability was really the driving factor.
Yeah, which is something that, you know, we've been pressing on our students as well, but this wasn't always the case in the United States either, right? People like to look back to previous generations, even especially in the mid-century, where architects were much more engaged on site. And this, of course, happened before, when we mentioned it earlier, a liability crisis of the 1980s, which many people in the call perhaps remember still, but just were the fact that architecture firms were becoming uninsurable. And contracts were written specifically to shed risk, right? And that's the context in which many of us have been working for you know, the last decades. And I think, though, that we're seeing steadily a call for and also experiments in moving beyond that, which will involve kind of a full court press, not just from the architects, but also from the lawyers, and also buy-in, frankly, an agreement from the contractors and the clients, which is easier said than done. Because as Elizabeth was saying, one thing that came out of the conversations is that, you know, architects could certainly build models to a higher level of detail, but convincing a client to pay for that additional service when a client is not accustomed to paying for that level of detail is a whole other challenge. So this is why conversations are important, and engaging. It's not going to be solved just by the architects, that's for sure.
No, that's definitely true. I'm going to address a couple more of the questions relatively quickly. So Eric's question, is this a standalone project that's now complete, or a single phase of a multi-phase renovation of Gunn Hall, which involves what else? So I have to say, it's actually, we've been doing a series of renovations. I'm very proud of the very first one, which was renovating the bathrooms in this building, which hadn't been renovated for a very long time. We discovered that on the ground floor, the men's room was actually bigger than the women's room. So that has been changed. They've been flipped, much to the surprise of many of our alumni. But so we've been doing changes all along, but this is obviously a very big one. Right now, we don't have others on the books yet, though I will say, now that the trays are so comfortable, the faculty are suddenly telling me how cold their offices are, because of course the single pane glazing right behind me is indeed an issue. So a couple of the other questions here. The response by the students, I think the returning students are very excited about the space in the trays. The new students don't realize what it was like before. And so I keep telling them, I think they're probably sick of hearing me talk about the windows. But I think that that's important. I do want someone to address Mary's question about the bird safety. And I wonder, David, if that came up as an issue of the challenge of bird safety with glass buildings.
It did come up, and we have not had a bird strike to my knowledge. One of the things that we wondered is, you know, the nature of because it's primarily going to happen on the north, and it's primarily going to happen on the south, but north or south. The VIGs have these almost microscopic spacers. The reason that which are necessary so that even though you have a very thin cavity in there, because it's a vacuum, the tendency of the glass is to bow towards the center, and you get what I call the saran wrap reflections that you get from cheap curtain walls. So in order to avoid that, they put these tiny little stainless steel spacers in there. And I'm wondering if the birds can see those. I don't know.
Oh, interesting.
It was speculation. I guess my full answer is that yes, it was discussed. I think there was a little bit of a wait and see attitude as to whether or not we would need to apply anything. And thus far, the results seem to be pretty good, because they aren't that big, the panes of glass. They also have the little gasket for the to evacuate the air, and the desiccant down at the bottom. So there are these little things in there which, if you're a bird flying at it, you can see they're there. You know, it doesn't look like there's nothing there.
We do also have Remy the cat, which might come into play in terms of bird safety around GSD, but that's another story, and not our fault. I haven't seen Remy get a cat. I mean, Remy get a bird. Louis or Louis, I don't know if you go by Louis or Louis Wasserman, how is the use of and the allocation of the studio space trays changed in the 50 years since original construction? If you look at original photos, or if you are an older alum, you know that there was essentially a lounge in the mezzanine space, the first tray space that's now used for desks. The population of design students at the GSD is now up to, there are about 650 desks in the trays. So there are a lot of desks. The desk size changed for new desks that were put in. They're a little bit smaller, so more were put in. Don't tell the students that some of the desks are smaller than other desks. I think they've probably figured it out. We have about 650 desks in the trays, but we have introduced recently 3 collaborative spaces in the trays. I think it was very important to me that the trays not just be spaces for individual desks, but also for teaching. So we have 2 tables that are used for seminars, and then 1 big space that can be used for pinups, seminars. Individuals can sit there and work when it's not being used for class time. So essentially trying to introduce class space within the trays was, I think, something really important. I want to end our Q&A on a topic that will take the remaining time, I think, which is AI. And so Giancarlo brought this up, saying, looking towards the future of practice, do you foresee AI empowering the architect in needing less consultation? So I think this goes back to this question of collaboration to formulate a design, or do you see the potential liabilities of this outweighing the current structure of an architect-consultant relationship? MEP, fire, etc. And so let me lob the inevitable AI question at you, but it's one that's obviously on everyone's mind.
Yeah, Elizabeth and I have both been doing plenty of work. We've done stuff collaborating on this. Elizabeth, you want to start, and we can, right.
Sure. Yeah. I love this question. The students love this question. Everyone loves this question. Yeah, no, I mean, so this panel on expertise was fascinating, right? Because I think there's a lot of fear in the professions about diminishing expertise and what is our expertise. Or Beth actually just written a question about this way that competency is being redefined. And if in society our job is to provide the public with health, safety, and welfare, and AI is going to be able to more effectively check building codes than we are we writing ourselves out of our value to society a little bit? So there's obviously a lot of fear around this. On the other hand, there was this really wonderful conversation that happened a little bit behind the scenes between the presidents of the AIA, ABA, and AMA. It was actually really hopeful. And, in this kind of larger agenda of us, of course, being of service to society, there's a hope that maybe we can actually expand our capacity and allow the computers to do what computers are good at and humans to do what humans are good at. And so it's absolutely, it comes back to this question of how do we enable better human and non-human collaboration? And that's something that, interestingly, the landscape department is very interested in too, though for different reasons. And I think it's a related dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, Elizabeth and I both participated in symposia here in New York on AI and its applications, AI specifically its applications today in practice. And I think the consensus coming out of so many of the conversations, even some in this issue right now, is that, a lot of it's the famous last words, right? But a lot of the concern about architects as designers being displaced by technology, anyone we've seen working in the space admits that we're still a ways off from having truly automated building design platforms, right? And in many cases, as Elizabeth is saying, these tools are enabling, especially younger generations that are adapting it very quickly, to actually, level up in their abilities to produce designs and experiment. What also something that's been coming out that I think is just worth noting is that AI is also impacting practice, however, in ways that aren't just about automated building design. So much of what the conversation has been focusing on is imagining, we're going to have automated floor plans, automated test fits, and automated, massing studies. What I've seen some very interesting things happening now are actually behind the scenes, such as, and this was talked about at a symposium by Martha Tsikari, who's one of the contributors in the conversation, this issue from Foster and Partners, where she was talking about actually Foster building in-house chat tools to help make project information and database information, project information easier to search and to share internally, right? Immediately light bulb went off in my head. I think it's a very interesting development when we think about how offices work. So many of we've worked in practices where project information lives in the heads of project architects who have been in a practice for years, right? And the way we all came up, right, and learned was, if you were doing a foundation detail for the first time, you went and talked to Gary on the 3rd floor or something like that. And that's actually how the ecology of offices and the way information is passed on to the next generation has worked for so many decades, and if not longer, certainly longer. And if that information becomes easily searchable and storable without humans involved, I think it starts to change perhaps relationships within offices, and actually the value of retaining staff. These questions are going to come up, I think, perhaps much sooner in practice than questions of, oh, will we be replaced by a bot that's going to design a building? And going to be questions of, will I, as a more experienced architect, still have value in this office if the knowledge that I have accumulated and embedded over the years is now easily offloaded to a searchable database in the practice? So that's not a doom and gloom projection. I just think that those are the types of questions I think it's really important for us to be looking at, because that potentially will change the fabric of practice and architecture in a way that might happen much sooner, actually, than us being, architects being supplanted by tools out in the marketplace. So I'll just leave us with that. That's a conversation very much to be continued and is very much in, I think, early stages. So,
David,
very
AI.
thoughtful remarks. I won't add. Did you, Sarah?
AI, how's that affecting your world?
Oh, it's slowly, because I think a lot of people who do what I do sort of sat back and say, oh, well, it's one thing to bang out housing or even hospitals or things like this with new construction, but when you're dealing with existing buildings, which increasingly we are dealing with these days, and certainly the demand from students for projects and renovation and adaptive reuse is seemingly limitless these days. They're harder to sort of make real use of AI, but I think at the rate in which the technology will evolve, that it will creep more into the practice. I think it's already. Things like specifications and that sort of thing. Again, more not non-design related issues, but still things that are part of practice, as Jacob was talking about, are impacting us as well. But as far as the sort of so much of what you're looking at in these buildings involves a certain degree of, for lack of a better word, connoisseurship and perspective and understanding about why something is the way it is, that I think is going to be a little difficult in the near future for an AI model to ramp up to. I could be wrong. I'm a complete novice with this stuff, but I think it's interesting that, as a matter of fact, where I see it more than I do in practice is among my students, and how they are using it, and how they are using it to discuss what are often very nuanced and difficult subjects. And a couple of the students have really done some quite brilliant things with it. It's quite impressive. I think for the most part, they're not using it, but those who do, make no bones about it, and are doing it in a self-critical and a challenging way.
Can I say?
Go ahead, Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, no, I just, in relationship to David's, area of expertise, I've been doing a little bit of work recently with the Center for Green Buildings and Cities around this issue of automation and performance modeling around energy efficiency. And what comes out of it, of course, is, trying to do this in a way that is as human as possible, but also, reduce our carbon footprint. But it's conceptually, it's kind of crazy, because if you think about it, you have a building completely integrated with computers. And so you've designed this kind of physical thing, but you have this data running through it, not only from inside the house, but it's also connected to the internet and responding to the weather and doing all of these other things. And frankly, the DNA of what it is to make architecture is fundamentally changed. It's changing and going on and on and on after you design the thing. So I think it's pretty fascinating.
So I have to say that the GSD's sort of longstanding and ongoing embrace of practice as an exciting field and a field that needs our attention within a school is part of what brought me back here. And I find such an exciting part of the school. We have many practice courses, unlike a lot of schools that only have one, and it's the sort of groan of pro-prac that people feel obliged to take, whereas here I feel like our students embrace the possibility that practice is a place where they're going to go and try and make changes to the world of practice by learning how it's changing right now. I think the question of AI, I find your answers both exciting and tantalizing. Sort of it is a kind of I think a soundbite for, or an amuse-bouche for, a future dinner, or at least a future town hall, because I think that it's true that we are still learning how it's going to be used, and it's used in certain ways pedagogically, and it's changing the field. I think, CC, in your Q&A there, that architects may need to really focus on our soft skills. I would say soft skills include some of the things that David was talking about in terms of connoisseurship or judgment or collaboration. And so, yes, I think it's not, AI is not going to kill off architecture, but it is going to actually change our modes of practice in some interesting ways. We're at the end of our time, and I am really happy that this was such a robust discussion. It doesn't surprise me that the three of you were just the perfect people to come at this discussion right now. I encourage our audience to get the issue, but I also encourage you to come by the school, come see those windows for yourselves. So Eric, when you ask, like, how are our alumni going to react to being in the building, it's not going to seem foreign to you. I don't think it's going to be too strange, but I think you will immediately notice the difference. And I think it's just worth coming by and seeing it. I also encourage you to tune into our public events, come by and see our exhibitions. Again, the Envisioning Cluny exhibit, which is up for 2 months, is an astonishing exhibit to see in the lobby right now. And so there's just a lot going on. And so join us in any way that you can. And thank you for taking the time out of your day today to be with us today. And a huge thank you to David, Elizabeth, and Jacob.